Welcome to this week's market presentation. Latest news.
In the latest news, last week 19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace, with several being shot down by Polish forces. It remains to be seen whether this was an accidental incursion into Polish airspace or a deliberate attack by Russia. Russia's intentions remain unclear, but if proven deliberate, could have been a test of NATO's air defense readiness, reaction time, and coordination. As a response to the incursion into Polish airspace, NATO allies are ramping up pressure on Russia, with the US stating and calling for G7, EU, and NATO members to completely halt the purchase of Russian energy and to collectively impose high secondary tariffs on China and India until they do the same. President Trump announced that additional tariffs or sanctions on Russia will be based on EU countries in particular taking similar action. The sanctions escalation versus Russia could potentially reduce Russian oil and gas exports, adding to the tightness in global energy markets. In the Middle East, Israeli military carried out a strike targeting Hamas leaders in Doha in Qatar, an unprecedented action against not only a US ally, but one of the key countries that had been mediating discussions between Israel and Hamas, as well as between Israel and Iran. Qatar's promised collective response is now being discussed at an emergency Arab Islamic summit in Doha, with the Gulf countries strongly condemning the attack by Israel. The impact on energy markets has so far been mild, with no significant reaction to the news. However, it is certainly heightening the geopolitical risk premium for oil and LNG, especially given Qatar's position as the world's third largest LNG exporter. It certainly makes the likelihood of an end to the conflict in Gaza dimming, given the escalation. Over in Europe, the French political crisis continues. François Barrou's government fell after losing a confidence vote and forced Macron to appoint his seventh prime minister of his tenure. The reaction from financial institutions was to downgrade France's credit rating from an AA- to an A+, France's lowest score on record. The new prime minister will face budget challenges amid political instability and rising debt, with strikes across the country already taking place, and as we'll see later, impacting France's nuclear sector. The impact on markets and energy prices was a negative one, with the French 10-year bond yields rising, signaling higher borrowing costs and potential fiscal tightening, with a prospect of a negative impact to industrial activity. The overall negative sentiment for European demand has outweighed some of the impact on Brent crude oil prices, although the impact remains limited for now. In the shorter term, the length and impact of the strikes will certainly have a bigger role shaping prices in the coming weeks. And lastly, moving over to the US, the US Federal Reserve is expected to move ahead with an interest rate cut in their September meeting this week. The main factors pushing the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates at this meeting are the continuing signs of a weaker labor market and a slowing of the US economy. Lower interest rates could lead to a weaker US dollar, which would in turn add some upward pressure to oil prices, given that commodities are priced in US dollars. The improved risk appetite boosted equity markets and energy demand expectations, although the soft economic data is still weighing those expectations as well, keeping things more uncertain.
Weather.
Moving on to the latest weather forecast, we note warmer temperatures forecasted over the course of this week before cooling down over the weekend and early next week. Precipitation is still expected to remain adequate, particularly in the Nordic region, with the remainder of Western and Central Europe seeing more limited precipitation throughout the week before picking up again early next week. Wind speeds, which have been more favorable over the past week, are expected to weaken as we move through this week and into next week. Lastly, the Atlantic hurricane outlook is showing a greater than 60% chance of a tropical storm or cyclone forming in the Atlantic in what could prove one last storm in this year's rather uneventful hurricane season.
Microeconomics.
Inflation figures in the US were released, which showcased a further increase in the year-over-year inflation rate up to 2.9%. Core inflation remained unchanged at 3.1%. As the Federal Reserve thinks about reducing interest rates, the pressure on inflation will certainly pick up, with many analysts predicting that as interest rates are lowered, inflation will only increase further away from the central bank's 2% target.
Crude oil and LPG.
Looking at crude oil prices, we note the slight upward movement in the market over the past week, with prices increasing around 1.5% for WTI and just over 2% for Brent. Overall, prices remained at relatively lower levels than we've seen over the last few years, owing to the oversupplied nature of the market. That is driven by, on the one hand, weaker demand globally as a result of the negative impact that the tariffs set by the US have had on global growth, while on the supply side of things, the decision by OPEC Plus to continue increasing production quotas throughout this past year have led to greater global supplies. The EIA's latest balance outlook continues to showcase an oversupplied market through the end of this year and through 2026. This outlook has pushed the EIA to forecast oil prices dipping to around $50 per barrel in the first half of 2026.
Natural gas.
Moving on to natural gas prices. Natural gas prices saw limited movement over the past week, just a slight uptick week over week, with the frontier moving up just under 2% over the past days. Further along the curve, the decreases are more modest, with prices decreasing by just 1% when we look at Cal 2028. Over onto the fundamentals, storage levels in Europe moved to just under 81% as of the end of last week, just 9% now below the 90% target to be reached ahead of this winter. The injection rate over the past week weakened, moving closer in line with the average since 2012 on the back of a decrease in Norwegian gas flows as the maintenance period continues. Nonetheless, the decreases have been more modest than they were the last couple of years, resulting in an improved injection rate compared to the last 2 years. The high injection rate over the past week has continued to help narrow the gas storage deficit versus the previous year, which now stands at around 13%. On a country level, we note that Germany remains below the European average, and given that other countries are already at the 90% target or very close to it, as we look to the next weeks, the majority of injections into storage will take place in Germany, with a close eye being kept on it as we look to that 90% target to be reached. Looking at the total supply and demand situation in Europe, we note an uptick in total demand over the past week, while total supply has eased further slightly, primarily on the back of weaker flows from Norway, which, as you can see here, are in the midst of their fall maintenance period. This maintenance season has not pushed flows to as low as they were in 2023 and 2024, giving some pause to the market. Nonetheless, the prospect of additional maintenance needs or extended maintenance needs continue to add some volatility and uncertainty to the market in the short term. Over in LNG sendouts, we've seen that uptick in LNG sendouts to compensate for the loss of Norwegian gas flows, with a bit of stability over the past week. In terms of LNG imports, we're seeing an uptick in LNG imports into Europe as price competition with Asia fades, especially as temperatures in the region start cooling down, reducing their demand for additional gas imports. Overall, we are seeing US LNG exporters being able to have larger profit margins shipping to Europe versus Asia, facilitating the increase in LNG imports to Europe that we've seen over the last week.
Coal.
Moving on to coal markets, coal prices saw a bearish price evolution with prices decreasing over the past week, mostly in the API2 index for the year ahead, down 1.5% week over week. Over in Asia, looking at the Newcastle index for the year ahead, we see a 4.6% drop week over week. Over in Europe, coal prices are being weighed down by weaker overall consumption in Europe. In Germany, the retirement of coal-fired power generation continues faster than had been planned for 2030, reducing total demand in the continent. Additionally, we are seeing a roughly 9.1% decrease in coal-fired power generation year over year in the month of August, adding to the lower demand for coal in Europe. Over in Asia, we are seeing increases in exports and production in India and Indonesia as weather conditions improve, while over in China, we are seeing slightly lower demand levels as a result of the slower economic activity that we see domestically.
EU and UK emission allowances.
Looking at emission allowances next, here we note the relative stability in the price level over the past week. However, that is in the face of a clear bullish price evolution across the European and UK carbon prices over the last few weeks. Current prices in Europe have reached 7-month highs over the last week, pushing up week over week. Here on the demand side of things, we note the compliance deadline coming up on September 30th and the expectations of tighter supply conditions as we look to 2026, given the expected reduction in total emission allowances to be put into the market. Over on the UK side of things, prices remain elevated on the back of those expectations of linking the EU and UK carbon markets, which when we look at the price level, still show a significant difference there. In terms of power sector emissions, we continue to note those emissions are near the bottom of the range over the past 5 years, easing the pressure on carbon prices. And then in terms of investment fund positions, we note the uptick over the last week there, with those expectations being anchoring in the recent bullish price evolution we see in the market.
Electricity.
Moving on to electricity markets, we note the slight decreases we see, particularly for the forward years, although prices remain elevated compared to where we were just a month ago. The price evolution across European markets has been very similar as to that of Germany, with most markets seeing an uptick in the price level over the past few weeks, with prices over the past week remaining relatively stable to slightly downwards. In terms of total demand and residual load saw a slight downturn over the past week, while total grid demand remained relatively stable week over week, both near the bottom of the range since 2019. On the European supply mix, we note that solar power generation has peaked following the summer period. We're also seeing nuclear power generation starting to stabilize its share of the power mix, driven primarily by the stability in the French nuclear power output. At the same time, we do see that upward trend in the evolution of the share of natural gas-fired power generation. In terms of nuclear power output, we see the French nuclear generation remaining relatively stable over the past few weeks. There are expectations of a further increase in output, which have been hampered by the ongoing strikes in France, which have taken out 2.7 gigawatt hours of production. In terms of renewable power generation, we see that in line with last year's levels at the top of the range over the past 5 years, and a relatively stable evolution week over week. The same can be said for fossil fuel power generation, although in this case, producing at the bottom of the range over the past 5 years. Wind power generation over the past week has remained adequate given the better than anticipated wind speeds. On the other hand, solar power generation, although remaining at a record high for this time of year, is clearly in the downward phase that is typical for this time of year. Fossil gas generation has remained relatively stable over the last few weeks, just a slight uptick over the last couple of weeks there, but still near the bottom of the range over the last 5 years, while fossil hard coal generation remains at the bottom of that range, adding to the bearish sentiment in coal markets in Europe. Lastly, looking at the guarantees of origin, we note the bearish price evolution, particularly for 2025 and 2026, as supply expectations remain strong, particularly for 2025, easing the pressure on prices. Nonetheless, further along the curve, we definitely see the strong demand growth expectations adding pressure on prices then. That covers this week's market presentation. Thank you for joining.